This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. President Carter delivers a special address to the United Nations this evening, and he's expected to place particular emphasis on his continuing campaign for worldwide human rights. He arrived in New York after wrapping up his first Meet the People tour that took him to a town meeting in Massachusetts and an energy conference in West Virginia. Robert Pierpoint reports.
The president's UN speech tonight is wide-ranging, but its greatest impact is almost sure to come from his strong words on human rights. Noting that all the signatories of the UN Charter have pledged themselves to observe and respect basic human rights, President Carter declares, quote, "Thus, no member of the United Nations can claim that mistreatment of its citizens is solely its own business," reminding the UN diplomats that this is a fundamental and historic American birthright. The president further says, ours is a commitment, not just a political posture. President Carter also suggests the UN Human Rights Commission should be more active and should move back to New York, where a free press can keep an eye on it. Finally, in what sounds almost like a challenge, President Carter declares that when gross or widespread violations take place in human rights that violate the UN Charter or the Helsinki Agreement, it is the concern of all and must be taken as seriously as violations of other international agreements. The president also stresses tonight his hopes for a nuclear disarmament agreement with the Soviet Union, apparently in the belief that this can be done despite his obvious dispute with the Kremlin over human rights. Robert Pierpoint, CBS News, Charleston, West Virginia.
President Carter's United Nations address this evening will be carried live on CBS beginning at 7:30 Eastern Time. During that town meeting he attended in Clinton, Massachusetts last night, Mr. Carter talked about a Middle East peace, and that triggered a flurry of diplomatic questions today. The president had said one solution to the Palestinian problem should be a homeland for refugees, but he did not elaborate. The remark appeared to be the latest in a string of surprises he has sprung on the foreign policy experts, both his own and those of other nations, as Marvin Kalb reports.
To the president's critics, it's called the open mouth policy. To his supporters, it's a refreshing change from the old-time mumbo-jumbo and secrecy. Either way, it is clear Mr. Carter's eagerness to expose his knowledge about foreign policy has baffled diplomats along Embassy Row, confused and embarrassed his own bureaucracy, and created a bewildering international situation. At his town hall meeting last night, even the president acknowledged the problem.
I've been criticized by some in the news media in the last 8 weeks about telling the American people too much.
But then he proceeded to add even more confusion by raising the possibility of a Palestinian homeland.
There has to be a homeland provided for the Palestinian refugees who have suffered for many, many years.
The president seems to enjoy the process of ventilating ideas and proposals. Witness, for example, this avalanche at his last news conference.
The Arab nations, the Israeli nation, has to agree on permanent and recognized borders where sovereignty is legal as mutually agreed. My commitment to withdraw American ground troops from Korea has not changed. We've also proposed that the Indian Ocean be completely demilitarized.
And it's not just the president who is keeping the diplomatic world guessing. It is also his UN ambassador, Andrew Young. His comments, for example, about Cuba, Africa, and Great Britain have produced a succession of official clarifications. Even one of Young's deputies, Brady Tyson, intoxicated by this apparent license to speak one's mind, spoke his at a recent meeting of the UN Human Rights Commission, apologizing for America's role in undermining the Chilean regime of Salvador Allende. But unlike Young, Tyson got reprimanded. On Capitol Hill, this has created more than just confusion. It's also created a political opportunity for the Republicans.
I have to be also concerned about this do-it-yourself diplomacy that with Andy Young and saying the things that he wants to say at the drop of a hat, and the president himself on a given moment.
But Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the president's national security advisor, sees careful planning where others see the signs of inexperience.
The public simply hasn't become accustomed to a truly open style. But that open style, I want to emphasize, is based very much on premeditation. When the president speaks, he speaks with considerable authority, with a great deal of forethought.
So far as one can tell, Brzezinski did not know that the president was going to talk publicly about a Palestinian homeland, nor did Secretary of State Vance, nor any top Middle East expert, and they spent most of the day trying to contain the diplomatic damage. Most officials here applaud the president's candor, but wonder whether his outspoken style can genuinely coexist with delicate diplomacy, especially in the volatile Middle East. Marvin Kalb, CBS News, the State Department.
Presidential News Secretary Jody Powell played down Mr. Carter's reference to a homeland for Palestinians, saying it has no particular significance. But Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat said in Cairo that the remark was an important step that touched the core of the problem. In Israel, however, Prime Minister Rabin said the remark troubled him. President Carter, on his visit to West Virginia today, gave some clues to the energy program he's formulating. He proclaimed an end to the Nixon policy of self-sufficiency and spoke of, quote, one inevitable major shift from oil and gas to coal. Bob Schieffer has more on the story.
Spring arrived in West Virginia ahead of Mr. Carter, so it was a beautiful day as he came to the Gold Dome state capitol here. After gulping down a hamburger and French fries with Governor Jay Rockefeller in the Capitol employees' dining room, Mr. Carter convened the panel of energy experts. It included administration officials, one working coal miner, and representatives of coal unions, the power companies, and consumer groups. Mr. Carter said he had come here mostly to learn, and since West Virginia is a leading coal-producing state, much of the discussion related to coal. But one of the first things he learned was that consumers are mainly concerned about rising utility bills.
It seems as though it was so easy for him to say, we'll just pass the costs over to the consumer. And that's what really upsets me. You know, it almost straightens my hair. I sat down last night with my husband and we paid our monthly bills, and I totaled up the utility bills and they came to $120. The cost cannot continue to be passed on to the consumers. It's not very much more that we'll be able to stand.
The administration's energy chief, James Schlesinger, painted a grim picture of the energy situation, saying by the 21st century, America's oil and gas will be gone. He said that will require strict conservation now. So strict that Mr. Carter predicted the energy conservation program he'll announce next month will probably cost him some of his popularity.
But I'm willing to give up some of my own personal popularity among the people of this nation to require them to face the brutal facts that we all are going to have to work together to deal with the impending crisis that's going to come regardless in future years as energy runs out.
Although Mr. Carter strongly suggested that his energy program will be a tough one requiring sacrifice, he gave few specifics as to just what that program will include. Aides said that was because this was not a forum to lay out energy policy. Rather, they said this was a time to gather ideas on what the policy ought to be. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Charleston, West Virginia.
Democratic Senator Abraham Ribicoff predicted today that Mr. Carter will face the biggest fight of his presidency when he tries to push his energy proposals through Congress. Mr. Carter's visit to West Virginia followed that overnight stay in Clinton, Massachusetts. Gary Shepard reports on Clinton's morning after.
The president left town just before 9 o'clock this morning after having breakfast with the Thompsons, his host family. The occasion made two of the Thompson children late for their high school classes. So before he departed, Mr. Carter wrote a note to the teacher.
Please excuse Jane for being late. She had a guest in her home.
Were you able to sleep last night with the president in the next room or the new room over?
Hey, if I can sleep with 8 kids, I can sleep with him.
Clinton went back to being just another small town today after its brief stint in the national limelight. The crowds were gone, and things were slowly getting back to normal. The fellow who was selling Jimmy Carter T-shirts yesterday at full price was having a clearance sale today, but there were few takers.
Yeah, I cut my prices.
From what to what?
From $4 to $2.50.
Okay, why is that?
St. Patrick's Day sale.